it hasn't arrived. Despite all this waiting, the Doomsday trailer still hasn't been released yet. However, at CinemaCon, aside from the Doomsday footage, Marvel made one other announcement: the re-release of Avengers Endgame. I mean, technically, this should be considered a re-release since they've already re-released it once before, haven't they? Marvel stated that they are planning to re-release Avengers Endgame in September, prior to Doomsday. The reasoning behind this is that Doomsday will, in a way, be connected to Endgame and is set to serve as its sequel. But that's not the interesting part. I mean, we already knew that much. We've discussed it many times. The truly interesting aspect is that they intend to re-release Avengers Endgame with certain changes incorporated into it, so that the film can effectively act as a proper narrative bridge. Now the question arises, what exactly are these changes? I mean, if you were to sit down and watch Avengers Endgame one more time, you would realize that they essentially opened Pandora's box back then. There are so many loose threads that you could grab just one of them and spin it off into 3 entirely different movies. But let's address these points one by one. The very first probable connection involves Thanos destroying the Infinity Stones. If you recall, after snapping his fingers, Thanos retires to his farm to start growing crops and cooking meals. The Avengers eventually confront him there and subsequently take him out. However, before that happens, he reveals that he used the stones themselves to destroy the stones, reducing them to atoms. Now, this detail is particularly significant because in this specific scene, when Bruce goes to meet the Ancient One, she clearly explains to him that the Infinity Stones are not merely objects, but powerful cosmic entities responsible for maintaining the balance of the entire timeline. Should even a single one of them be harmed, the entire timeline could be jeopardized. Yet Thanos completely destroyed them all. Furthermore, the comic books also establish that if the Infinity Stones are destroyed for any reason, the entire universe falls into peril. In fact, the creators themselves have already demonstrated this concept in the new Avengers prelude leading up to the new Secret Wars storyline. In that arc, when Captain America dons the gauntlet and punches a planet to stop an incursion, the sheer force of the impact is so immense that the Infinity Stones, save for one, shatter completely. While it is true that they eventually returned, my point remains. The destruction of the Infinity Stones is no trivial matter. It is not something that can simply happen without consequence, leaving everything perfectly fine. The entire universe could be forced to face the repercussions of such an event. Thus, it is conceivable that the creators might, in some way, connect this specific point to the character of Doom. Moreover, given that this scenario has already played out in comic book storylines like Secret Wars, it is certainly a narrative avenue they could pursue. However, there is one small caveat to consider here. Thanos explicitly states that he reduced the Infinity Stones to their constituent atoms. This implies that in some capacity, however minute, they still exist. Now, in the comic books, what happens is that at the very moment the Infinity Stones are destroyed, later on, once everything returns to normal and a new rebooted universe is established, these very same Infinity Stones return once again by reconstituting themselves. Capitalizing on that specific moment, Marvel Comics decided to retcon their own Infinity Stones to align with the style of the MCU. For instance, the Space Stone was originally purple. However, when it reconstituted and reformed, its color changed to blue, just as it appears in the MCU. So it is quite possible that we might witness this particular development in some form or another, perhaps leading up to Secret Wars, since Secret Wars features a pivotal moment involving the use of the gauntlet. That should be exciting. Next, there is a loose end regarding Loki breaking away from his original timeline and subsequently being captured by the TVA. However, I don't believe they will choose to focus on that storyline. Firstly, because the TVA has already pruned that specific timeline. And secondly, because Loki has his own distinct character arc, one that, in a sense, he has already brought to completion. Therefore, I do not anticipate this particular plot point being revisited or addressed. Following that, we have the Steve versus Steve confrontation. That specific timeline is currently in a precarious state. Although Steve Rogers successfully wiped the memories of his alternate counterpart, S.H.I.E.L.D. has nevertheless discovered that this other Steve possesses knowledge regarding Hydra and various other sensitive matters. Consequently, the situation is bound to spiral into chaos. Furthermore, this memory wipe procedure doesn't tend to work very effectively on Captain America. In fact, during the Secret Wars storyline, the Avengers attempt to wipe Steve's memory. However, when he eventually regains his recollections, he is, understandably, not at all pleased about it. Now, the third point isn't technically related to Avengers Endgame. In Infinity War, when Doctor Strange views the 14 million possible outcomes, I feel that constitutes a highly significant plot point, one that the creators could potentially explore in Doomsday. Perhaps it could be revealed that Doctor Strange didn't merely foresee events up to Thanos' defeat, but actually looked far beyond that point in the timeline. He already knew exactly what was destined to unfold across the multiverse. Incursions would occur. Subsequently, the entire Kang-related crisis would ensue, and crowning it all, Doctor Doom would make his arrival. And after witnessing this entire sequence of events, forward, he will attempt to bring this very storyline to fruition. In other words, much like they utilized Tony Stark in Avengers Endgame, they will now do the same with Doctor Doom. However, I remain skeptical about this entire scenario because, thus far, we haven't seen any significant mention of Doctor Strange in relation to Doomsday. Even if Doctor Strange does appear in Doomsday, he certainly won't be operating in the same capacity we saw him in during Infinity War. Plus, Doctor Strange plays a pivotal role in Secret Wars, both in the preceding series and within Secret Wars itself. Essentially, he initially opposes Doctor Doom. Then, eventually, he begins to support him, only for it to be revealed later that the man is actually a triple agent. To execute all of this effectively, you would need to allocate a substantial amount of screen time to Doctor Strange. You can't simply depict it as something that happened out of the blue. Poof! Battleworld is formed and Doctor Strange suddenly shows up. No, there has to be a narrative foundation underpinning it. If they manage to pull this off, even if only through a series of cameos, it would be incredibly satisfying. And then comes the most intriguing point, the Avengers time travel. Now, look, the act of the Avengers engaging in time travel isn't in itself a loose end. The actual loose end lies in the fact that the Avengers traveled back in time to retrieve certain items, yet failed to return them to their original places. I know Steve Rogers took all of the Infinity Stones with him, but as we've discussed countless times, returning them to their exact original state is a nearly impossible feat. So, what if the Russo brothers use Avengers Endgame to show us precisely this scenario? The events have unfolded, the movie has concluded, and we see Steve Rogers struggling to return the Infinity Stones to their rightful places, but he is failing. He may have managed to return some of them, but how on earth is he going to return the one to Vormir? Once he reaches the timeline involving Thor, how exactly is he going to get the Reality Stone back inside Jane? After all, her physical form has completely changed by now. Furthermore, the Space Stone has already been extracted from its containment cube. Consequently, pulling off that specific task would be a nearly impossible feat. So, the filmmakers might very well choose to depict all these difficult scenarios. I mean, they wouldn't need to do anything overly elaborate to convey this. Also, I'm not really expecting any dramatic changes stemming directly from the release of Avengers Endgame, as attempting something like that would be incredibly difficult to execute. Therefore, I anticipate that we might get to see one or perhaps two post-credit scenes. In one of these, we might be shown Steve Rogers living out his life with Peggy in that very same timeline from the 1940s and 50s. They might even fast forward the narrative by another 8 to 10 years, showing us that his child has grown up, and then reveal a crucial detail. Steve didn't just keep his Captain America suit intact, he also possesses Mjolnir, along with a few Infinity Stones that he was unable to return to their original timelines. Now, this would serve as the perfect setup for Doomsday. It aligns perfectly with the narrative trajectory we've been observing ever since Doctor Doom was first announced. Marvel has been subtly laying the groundwork for Doom, bit by bit, through various small post-credit scenes embedded in their recent films. For instance, Doctor Doom was briefly glimpsed in the background during Fantastic Four. Similarly, the post-credit scene in Thunderbolts carries the distinct vibe of a Doomsday prelude. We can expect something similar from Avengers Endgame, a post-credit scene that in just a brief moment continues Steve Rogers' story, specifically depicting how he set out to accomplish a task but ultimately failed. And it is precisely because of this failure that incursions are now occurring and the multiverse is beginning to fracture. Steve, however, remains completely oblivious to all of this. Then, in the final beat of the scene, we are shown Doctor Doom arriving right at his doorstep. But I feel that based on everything we've been told and shown so far, this story might actually turn out to be a bit different. I have a theory that this time around, Doctor Doom and Steve Rogers aren't working against each other, but rather together. Steve Rogers isn't at fault here. He has simply been manipulated by Doctor Doom, who, after all, is a master manipulator. Consequently, everything Steve Rogers is doing, albeit unknowingly, is in a way necessary to save the multiverse. However, the path he is currently following is not a virtuous one. But anyway, we've gotten a bit ahead of ourselves and lost the thread. So, what is the primary function of any post-credits scene? It is to effectively set up the upcoming movie and build anticipation for it. And what better moment could there be than the one we witnessed in the Endgame post-credits sequence? Steve is sharing that same dance with Peggy when he hears a knock at the door. He opens it. It could be Dr. Doom. Alternatively, there is a circulating theory, one that many people on the internet are discussing, suggesting that it won't be Doom who comes to Steve, but rather Loki. The reasoning behind this is that Steve's entire timeline is coming to an end, so Loki would arrive to whisk Steve and his family away to a different timeline, ensuring they can live out their lives in safety. However, this raises a question in my mind. Why would Loki do such a thing? If Loki has ever had a conversation with Steve, or shared even a handful of scenes with him, it would amount to less than 10 minutes in total. And that's just counting the Avengers 2012. In fact, Loki has had far more interaction with the Hulk, especially if you combine their screen time across the Avengers, Thor Ragnarok, and the 2 minutes they shared in Infinity War. So, why would he specifically seek out Steve Rogers to undertake this task? He has absolutely no motivation to do so, whereas I have something else entirely in mind. Dr. Doom knocks on Steve's door. He talks to him, and then he reveals this to us. The theory suggests that this entire universe is something we have actually seen before, specifically in Fantastic Four. This is because the world in which Steve Rogers is currently living with his family is in fact Earth 8 and 28. I know. It sounds ridiculous, but consider it from this perspective. Steve Rogers traveled back in time. Sometime around 1945, he reunited with Peggy. Now, Steve isn't the type of person to simply sit idly by after reuniting with her. He knows about Hydra, that they have infiltrated and taken over S.H.I.E.L.D. He also knows about Bucky. Consequently, he would likely attempt to alter the course of these events. If he were to change them, meaning he stopped Hydra and prevented Bucky from becoming the Winter Soldier, do you know what the repercussions would be? Hydra would be dismantled. As a result, the world would begin to evolve rapidly by utilizing Hydra's advanced technology. Furthermore, if Bucky never became the Winter Soldier, he never would have killed Tony's parents. Consequently, Tony would never have become Iron Man. Now let's assume Steve accomplished all of this by 1950. That leaves a full decade to develop their world using Hydra's tech. This is precisely the task undertaken by the Fantastic Four, who happen to be the only superheroes in this particular universe. This is because Steve Rogers operated entirely underground. No one else is aware of his activities, as he has no desire to step into the limelight. This detail serves to connect the post-credits scene of Fantastic Four directly to Steve Rogers. Dr. Doom sought out the Fantastic Four in this specific universe and timeline precisely because he needed to reach Steve. Thus, after his interaction with Sue, he heads straight to Steve Rogers. So, could a single post-credits scene in Avengers Endgame really convey all of this information to us? I don't think so. I simply feel that, yes, there is a distinct possibility of this happening, a probability where all these disparate elements could align perfectly. What if it were revealed that Steve Rogers himself traveled back in time and made certain changes that completely altered the entire timeline? What was supposed to happen later ended up happening earlier, and all that sort of stuff. That raises the question, should we really expect that much from the re-release of Avengers Endgame? Specifically, that it would introduce such massive changes or explain all of this to us in a single post-credits scene? No, probably not. You should pretty much assume that they are definitely re-releasing it as a pure cash grab, simply to make a little extra money. But hey, we can still get a little bit excited about it. I mean, just a little bit, right? So, I feel I should probably stop here. Once I get started, I tend to ramble off in all sorts of directions, like bringing up that whole Loki angle. Anyway, I should probably wrap this up. I'll catch you in the next one. I don't want to drag this out too long.